Um, I guess this falls into three parts, really. I think. I mean, first of all, I should say this is very much teamwork, along with Claire Keane, who's here today, and with John Walsh and Michael Savage, who've been working on this for a while. The three parts are really, first of all, to tell you a bit about what we are doing at the moment, because some of what we're doing, I think, links quite nicely with what themes that are being considered here. The second part is to think about how the approaches we're using could be extended to deal particularly with the equality dimensions that are of interest here. And then the third part is to think more broadly about how could we get there from here? What sort of path in terms of how this could be made to happen? Because again, there's some lessons from our experience along the way. We've been at this, I suppose, I think I started this in 1986, whatever. So I mean, it's been a long road. Some of this is now partially embedded in policy making, I think. So at least there's some successes to report in that. And there have been some cul-de-sacs that I might warn you about as well along the way. So that's where I'm broadly going to go. I should say I'm going to focus really on tax and welfare, where we can measure things in cash terms. I take Nat's point about the cash delusion that isn't everything, but it's a very important component of things. And in fact, Claire and I wrote a paper a number of years back as part of a big European project looking at the non-cash elements of income, which I'm happy to talk about in response to questions afterwards, but I hadn't prepared anything in advance, so we'll wing it for now. Okay. I guess, why do we need a tax benefit model? Because that's what SWITCH is. It stands for Simulating Welfare and Income Tax Changes. And I'm going to go fairly quickly over this stuff because I think, to some extent, I'm going to ask you to trust me. And again, you can quiz me on it afterwards if you want. But the real nub of this is that to get a nationally representative picture of the impact of tax and welfare policy changes, you need to start with a nationally representative survey of the population, where you know things about their incomes and labour market status and so on, and then apply it to that. You can't get there starting from the handful of examples that Nat pointed out that were in the finance documentation for the budget, or that the newspapers will produce and so on. You simply cannot get there. And you need to have the full sort of detail of all the nitty-gritty things. There's not just the headline numbers about payment rates. You need to know things about the own contribution to rent, back to school payments. All these other things need to be in there as well. I'm going to illustrate some of this using some work we've done with Switch, and take a slight detour in the first instance to talk about unemployment payments and financial incentives to work, because one of the most elaborate set of examples that's used to look at household incomes and whether people are better off in work or better off unemployed and so on is managed by the OECD. And what I'm going to point out is that while they are working not with 6 examples as we have with finance, they're working probably with 200 to 300 examples, but it still doesn't get there. You get an answer which is in fact misleading, and that's the point I want to make. I'll then move on to something which is more directly a concern here about the impact of budgetary policy, and indeed public sector pay cuts over the recession. So in a sense there we're looking at an equality impact in the sense of impact over the income distribution. How does it affect people on low incomes, middle incomes and high incomes? We can also look at impacts on the risk of poverty measure, which some of you may be familiar with as well. So looking not at particularly those at the lowest incomes. And then I want to move on and look at how the model could explore implications of policy options and choices in these other dimensions of policy, dimensions of equality. Okay, so without a tax benefit model, you have to rely on these examples, whether it's 6 or 30 or 200. And those examples don't really deal with the wide variation in people's circumstances in the real world. You need a large-scale survey with several thousand households to do that. And you can't build to this overall national picture. So moving quickly on, here is what the OECD would tell you about what they call the replacement rate, which is how much of somebody's income from employment is replaced if they're in unemployment. So a high replacement rate, which you see on this end, means that you're nearly as well off unemployed as employed. And you'll see Ireland, if you factor in rent and mortgage supplement, has a very high level here. If you don't factor it in, it's in the middle. And the comparison with the UK in particular, Ireland up here, the UK there, if you don't take into account housing costs. If you do take into account housing costs, with housing benefits being substantial in the UK, you get to here and here. Either way, Ireland looks like it's being much more favourable to the unemployed than the UK. Totally wrong. 88% of Ireland's unemployed don't receive rent and mortgage supplement. 88%, so you're looking at 1 in 10 who do. Most of Ireland's unemployed are single. Even if they're not single, they don't usually qualify for a qualified adult or qualified child increase. And in the UK, instead of 1 in 10 getting a housing benefit, it's 1 in 2. The way to deal with this is to work with a tax benefit model that's working with a large nationally representative sample. We do that here, the Institute for Fiscal Studies do in the UK. If we line up those numbers, we find that high replacement rates, above 70%, about the same proportions in both countries. If you move up to the very more extreme ones, yes, there are more in the Irish case, but it's still a low proportion, and that's narrowed down to, what's responsible for that is the structure of the rent and mortgage supplement. So yes, rent and mortgage supplement does create some very high replacement rates, but not very many of them. Okay, that's a very different picture that you get from looking at real world households in a nationally representative sample versus these constructed examples. And it matters, it clearly matters. The OECD numbers lead to newspaper headlines telling you the unemployed are having it easy. The real work which we published last autumn gives you a very different picture and tells you actually most unemployed people would be better off if they're in work, which is the point that we made well at that point, I think. Okay, so that's a sort of a methods point, but I think it's a very important one when you're thinking about moving to budget impact assessment on equality dimensions as well, because you want to get it right. Okay, you don't, and this is the sort of gold standard for this sort of stuff. This is internationally accepted as being the way to go with this stuff. We have a model, which is to say after 25 years, I suppose we take a certain pride in having got that far at least, that we have a model that deals with all of this stuff. As things happen, to flag this, and this is due, I guess, to the prescience of Lawrence Bond of the Equality Authority. I think even before the campaign got together about 9 months ago, I think it's about a year ago that Lawrence contacted me and asked, could we do a piece of work on the gender dimension of tax and welfare policy. And we've started on that work, and that should hit the streets before the end of the year is the plan to do that. So that's in the offing. Okay. Now, in terms of what you get for distributive impacts, just going back into the good times, between 1995 and 2001, the overall shape of budgets over that period didn't do very much either way for the low-income groups, and tended to favour the high-income groups. That's largely because over that sort of first half of the boom, the social welfare payments were being indexed in line with inflation, maybe a little bit more. But what's happening was tax cuts were being traded for wage moderation. So those tax cuts are coming in here into the benefits of the top three quintiles, or the top 60% of the population. Okay, what happens in the second half of the boom is that changes substantially, that the greatest gains are now for the low income, and social welfare increases were substantial in the early 2000s, and there was much less in terms of gain at the top of the distribution. Okay, I think it's worth having a sense of that as a backdrop to what's happening during the recession. And this is a little more elaborate. We've got 10 groups ranked from the lowest incomes here up to the highest incomes here. In contrast to the earlier slide, everybody's losing on average in those income groups. It's a complicated pattern. I mean, people very often talk about is it progressive in the sense that the lowest losses would be at the bottom, the highest losses at the top if it's progressive, and the reverse if it was the other way around. It's not as simple as that. Maybe just to make it easier to interpret, if you took away the bottom, the lowest income group, you'd probably say that is broadly progressive, that the greatest losses are at the top and smaller at the bottom. If you take away the second and third income groups, you'd probably say it's fairly flat for the bottom half of the distribution, but the top half of the distribution loses more than the bottom, and increasingly so with income as well. A lot of what's going on there is, so the really unusual part of this is the second and third, what I call it, income deciles, the next 10% slice of people, because each of these groups has the same number of people in them, or the same number of households in them. And this is very much to do with the fact that in these groups, you have more pensioners than you would elsewhere. And pensioners have been favoured by policy over this period, whereas other welfare payments got cut, pension payments did not, and that's what makes that group lose less than others. There's a lot of other, I'm not going to snow you with a lot of other figures and so on. There's a lot more that we've published on this, and a lot of other ways of cutting this information. But this is the kind of thing you can do once you have this framework in place to do this. Okay. Which equality dimensions could you include in this sort of framework? The gender one, we're underway with that, and say a report due later this year. On disability, we've had a look at the data, because that's always the main constraint, is how you got the data to do it. And there does seem to be information in the survey of income and living conditions which will allow us to include that in the same sort of way. And these other three are kind of simpler in terms of simple demographic components, which surveys would always have: age, marital status, family status, whether you have children or not. Those would be in the survey as well. So these are dimensions that could be incorporated. And obviously there are sort of economies of scale on the analysis side in terms of setting up this sort of work. I guess maybe to step back a little bit from this. In a lot of other countries, in larger countries, you would tend to have a tax benefit model that is in use in government as an in-house sort of thing. In the UK, they would have one in the Treasury and one in the Department of Work and Pensions. They probably don't trust each other enough to have just one. So they have two. And there are a number of sort of models in academic or policy research institutions like the Institute for Fiscal Studies or the University of Essex would have one as well. There are microsimulation units and so on as well. The costs of doing this are pretty substantial. And in a small country, it probably doesn't make sense to try and finance one in government and one outside. That's pretty much the line that we've reached in a sense here already. We went a certain distance in the initial work in the institute for our own bat. We reached a point where it needed much more substantial resources to try and model the welfare system and so on, and then it's been supported by the welfare system as well, by the institute's grant and aid from there on. So we have one model in Ireland which is servicing both needs. We supply the software to the government departments, and we use it ourselves to produce independent analysis. In terms of timing, I guess this means that the departments have the capacity to do this work in advance of the budget, and we would expect that they do. I think it's realistic to expect that they haven't waited till March to do all of this, whatever. They have started they have taken various lines in terms of what they will produce. Sometimes they've produced work on the day of the budget, based on this model. More recently, it's been somewhat later, but more detailed, a lot more detailed in terms of what they're producing. The other was in some ways sometimes rather superficial, sometimes looking only at the tax side and not at the welfare and so on, which isn't really satisfactory. We obviously cannot produce analysis of the budget until the budget exists. We managed to turn it around in about 24 hours, which means that if the budget's on a Tuesday, we get the work done on Wednesday and it's in the Irish Times on Thursday. I think the IFS is about the same. It needs a day to look over the numbers before you can do that, but that gets out there. We would also usually produce a more detailed piece for the quarterly economic commentary that comes out within a month or so after that. We missed that slot this year, partly because I was sick, but partly in a sense because we hadn't got the sort of staff resources on board to weather that and go ahead and do it anyway. This is so that's this broader issue in terms of if we're going to produce independent analysis, we used to produce about 6 or 7 papers a year using this model, on very much geared towards policy issues. Last year we produced 11, I think, and we could certainly we could certainly do more, but it needs the time to do it. And this is partly the reason I'm stressing this point is that when we come to widening this to include a quality analysis, it seems to me we're likely to end up being asked to do it because we have the infrastructure in a sense to start with. It does need resources to make this happen. There are various frameworks that could arrive at a successful outcome where this is done independently. One which we have tried in the past and doesn't work is for us to produce this as a piece of software that other people can use. We tried that, it really didn't work. And in fact, I don't know any other. The Euromod team is built around that idea, but in fact, it actually has huge barriers to entry because the technical level to understand. It's a question of, I suppose, it's a bit like fixing a car engine. I remember there was a story about a chap coming up being charged, 50 quid or whatever, and all the guy did was tighten a nut. And the guy says, that's way too much. That's way too much. He said, okay, I'll read you the invoice. So he just does the invoice. For fixing the nut, €2. 48 euro, which nut to fix. So it's a bit like that. It's just a kind of a technical obstacle. So we've been very keen to get this model more used, to build it into the policy environment and so on, and we've been working at that for a long time. We're very keen to do more of that, but there is a question of needing some resources at the core of this process to do that. Okay.
Thank you.